Tibetan protests against Chinese rule gathered steam over the past week. The Chinese government issued an ultimatum to protesters to turn themselves in or face harsh punishment. The Real News senior editor Paul Jay spoke to senior news analyst Aijaz Ahmad.
Aijaz, the Dalai Lama in a press conference very recently said to the independence movement in Tibet, he said, do not fight for independence. Tibet needs to stay part of China. The Tibetans need to get along with the Chinese. He threatened to resign if the leaders of the independence movement become violent.
If things become out of control, then my only option is completely resign.
He also critiqued the Chinese government, saying if the Chinese government continues any violence against Tibetans and against peaceful demonstrators, he'll also resign as a result of that. But his message, at least his public message, clearly is against independence, for peaceful reconciliation. Yet, in another press conference, the Chinese Prime Minister singled out the Dalai Lama and said he's the one to blame.
这起事件是由达赖集团有组织、有蓄谋、精心策划和煽动起来的。
So what do you make of all of this?
The government in exile in Dharamsala in India, which he heads, has been clearly implicated in it. It appears to me a coordinated action between the independence movement people located in India as well as their counterparts in Lhasa. The whole incident has put the Dalai Lama in a very, very awkward position, because his name is being used all the time by the people who are doing all that.
In his press conference, he said that these events are out of his control,
I'm sure it is out of his control.
He's also taken a position against boycotting the Olympics, which I assume increases the split with the militants in the Tibetan independence movement.
I think so, but you see, with or without boycott, if the violence continues, it embarrasses the Chinese anyway.
For the Dalai Lama, this is an issue of cultural repression, religious repression, not an issue of independence. For the independence movement in Tibet, it's much more a political question. It really is a question of secession. And that's quite a big difference in strategy.
I think the Dalai Lama is a much more realistic person. There is not a single state in the world that does not recognize Tibet as an integral part of Chinese territory. He has said that he is not for independence, he is for autonomy, and to that extent he is really isolated from the more militant sections which have organized this both inside Tibet as well as in India.
In a separate press conference, the Foreign Ministry spokesman Qin Jiang dismissed the Dalai Lama's calls for an investigation into the Chinese crackdown on the demonstrations.
其实国际社会应该关注的，应该问的正是达赖本人，他在这起打砸抢烧杀的严重暴力事件中、犯罪事件中，他扮演了什么样的角色？他起到了什么样的作用？受到审判的，应该接受调查的，正是达赖本人。
What you find here is that the Chinese are avoiding saying it has been organizing by the Dalai Lama himself. For the most part, they keep talking about the Dalai clique, by which they mean the government in exile. And what they are saying is that for us to open negotiations with the Dalai Lama, he would have to explicitly, institutionally dissociate himself from this so-called government in exile, because the very term government in exile is tied up with the demand for independence. So long as he is the head of the spiritual community, he is also the temporal head of that community, because he is born God King. If he were to dissociate himself from the exiled government, he would in effect say that this whole traditional setup of the Buddhist spiritual universe is incorrect, that there has to be a separation between the spiritual and the temporal. And the Dalai Lama, I think, is not willing quite to take that step.